Hi, this is Robert Kiyosaki, and you're listening to Capital Hacking. This is the most important thing you can listen to today.
Is the one.
I have a dream.
With great power comes great responsibility.
I could do this all day.
This is it. Don't get scared now.
They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom.
Cinderella story out of nowhere.
Did you know that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself?
Welcome back to The Big Show. John, Edwin, it is a pleasure to be on stage with you.
Man, today's show, we interviewed Kevin Leahy. He owns the podcast Pointman, and he is amazing. He's an amazing producer for podcasts. Started out with NPR. Actually, let's back up. He started out with a love of radio. So he would listen to Howard Stern. He was a delivery driver, and then he started studying radio and audio. What a show.
Yeah, I mean, if you're ever curious about starting a podcast, I think you'll learn everything you need in one episode here. But I mean, like philosophically, everything you need. But also, I found it great to hear how he got into BiggerPockets. So really great origin story there. I wanted to let you.
That was a divine appointment there, Josh.
Yeah, he was incredible in that story and how he got in there. And then we talked a little bit about, what he saw when he worked with BiggerPockets and what he sees about the future of all podcasting. I think you'll love this episode.
Let's go.
John, it is exciting to have Kevin Leahy here. Great to see you, Kevin. Welcome to The Big Show.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Kev, we're really excited to have you, and we'd love to learn a little bit more about you, your background, and your story. Could you kick us off?
I've been fascinated by radio and audio way before it was cool, or way before I knew it would actually be a good career path for me. So it goes back to like before the days of Grubhub and Uber Eats. I was driving, delivery driving for a company and driving all around San Diego, delivering meals to corporations. And I used to listen to Howard Stern on the radio. I used to listen to, podcasts before they were a thing, like downloading them on my MP3 player, and just really loved it for entertainment and wasn't quite into the education stuff yet. But over time, once I started to develop my skills and get into college, I started to listen to more news content and got into NPR type content and long form stuff and learning about journalism and the media, and kind of went down that route out of college and really started to learn about the craft of audio editing mostly and writing for the radio, and wound up in an internship at NPR headquarters in DC and stayed there for 8 years. So it was just a crash course in like telling stories on the radio and learning how to write for the news anchors there, learning how to go report a story and be resourceful. And that job took me to some crazy places, like went to the White House to interview the president, went to Iran to report on that country's political situation and their relationship with the US, went to Africa during Ebola. I kind of would take all the crazy assignments that people maybe a little older with families wouldn't want to take. So a lot of like sort of conflict reporting, and actually where all the stuff happened with Israel and Gaza, I had been there a couple years before all that popped off too. So kind of a crazy journey through audio, and journalism and media that wound up getting to kind of the next chapter, which is BiggerPockets, which we can get there too. But that's kind of where I come from.
Yeah, because that's actually the intro to you for us was through the BiggerPockets universe. Great podcast if you guys haven't heard it. And Kevin was responsible for 3 years. You were 3 years with them as their producer of podcasts. But before I ask you for that journey, because that's got to have an origin story in and of itself, did you say you were an actual on-air reporter for those conflict situations and like the White House?
Sometimes I would file the occasional on-air piece, but it was pretty rare. I was a producer. I did everything behind the scenes. So I would do everything from book our travel to hire a local person. They call them fixers, who are like, they have all the relationships on the ground. They speak the language. They know what's what, and they keep you safe as well. And so I would like hire those people and work with them, bring all the gear, be kind of the go-between between the on-air talent host and the decision makers back at the headquarters. and just kind of like be the person making all that stuff happen, and just kind of be another reporter on the ground, but not necessarily on the air. But if you Google my name and Bitcoin, you'll see an article that a report I filed for NPR kind of before Bitcoin popped off, where I actually buy some Bitcoin. I later sold it before it got really high.
Darn.
I've done some stuff about fantasy sports, daily fantasy sports online, and I've done some other things online. So if you Google me and NPR, you'll find some maybe some somewhat cringy pieces.
And before we go to the next origin story, NPR, you said it, you threw out there that you learned a lot about telling stories. That's actually NPR's greatest talent, I think. First of all, they have this over-the-top audio editing where it's all encompassing. I imagine I'm not the only one that says that, and maybe that's a well-known fact, but it feels like you've entered a room with people and/or an environment. Then they tell great stories. And so what I think their gift is they see the news through the lens of a witness. Maybe that's their gift. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do they claim their unique selling proposition is?
I think you're right. And I think some of NPR's struggles recently have come from maybe getting away from that core competency of theirs and becoming more like an imitation of CNN or, live cable news. But I think what really drew me to them was their focus on the craft of audio storytelling. When they would start a report from some faraway land, they didn't start by saying, oh, so-and-so, this official said this and this. They start with a scene of like a piece of audio and a sound of doing something by some river somewhere and someone getting water and basically showing you a vignette of why this matters in one person's life. And so it's like, this is a woman who gets water here and it's dirty. And so her family can't. And it's like, now I care. Like that's what drives us all, is caring about one person's story. Like they say that thing about like 10,000 people die and that's a statistic. One person dies and that's a tragedy. And I think they did that really well, of like, pick one person, tell the news story through their lens and bring you into that scene. So that's what I really loved. And we used to cut down interviews from 20 minutes to 7 minutes and just try to, distill it down to its essence without being unfair to the person.
Wow. I mean, how hard is it to do that? 20 minutes to 7 minutes? Because I can't even wrap my head around how that works.
You really have to be fair, and, you can't just take what is convenient for you. And sometimes we would, people, editors starting out will want to cut everything. They'll want to cut the breaths out of everything. Just cut everything. And I still sometimes work with freelancers online that do this, and they're cutting the little breaths and pauses. And like sometimes pauses are meaningful in a conversation. If you ask me a question, I really have to think about it, or I kind of like sigh. It's sort of expressing something about my feelings. And so maintaining that while also respecting the listener's time enough to say, we're not going to, put in that little diversion or that little aside. We're going to cut that out because it's not important. And, we want to be worth your time. Striking that balance was kind of key. And with audio editing, you can do a lot more, as far as like, if this was just an audio conversation, you guys could chop it up like crazy and make it half of what it is, and it wouldn't sound that bad. With video, you have to do a little more. It's hard, right? Because you're kind of jumping around and you'd have to kind of find ways to cover the edits.
Right.
But that was just a fantastic skill to learn, not only technically, but editorially and as far as fairness, and a lot of the things we see that become huge news stories these days where something was edited unfairly or someone was treated unfairly.
Wow. And then another question that I wrote down is, how did you go from working with NPR to getting into podcast producing?
It's a great question. So NPR launched our daily news podcast in 2017. This was after the New York Times launched their daily news podcast. And these are still some of the top 10 shows in the entire world right now, as far as downloads, which makes sense. Huge organizations producing a daily show. And so I was on the team that launched that podcast, yet I wasn't really involved in marketing it. I wasn't involved in knowing the profit and loss. I couldn't tell you how much an advertisement on that show cost. I was just kind of producing the content. And so I was an expert in that. I was not an expert in all these other things that make podcasting and business happen. So it was partly that desire to learn more about that process and have a wider view of it that drove me to start looking for some other opportunities. And it was also just getting a bit disenchanted with political news always, and how
Always, yeah.
combative and negative that has gotten, especially in the past, like 10 years. So I was looking for something different. I was getting a little into the rich dad, poor dad content on the side of rental properties. I had just dipped my toe into Airbnb. And so that can be a really addicting thing when you first start to get into it. I would go away on a business trip and just Airbnb my condo for a couple of days and make like $300-400. And I was like, this is incredible. Where do I seek out more content like this? And I became a fan of BiggerPockets. And over time, I just thought, what if these guys needed help with their podcast? And I go to their website and I look for all the jobs. It's all like full stack engineers, right? Like coders. I'm like, shoot, I can't BS my way into one of those jobs. Like, let's be honest. Like, that is not a fit. And then it says your dream job. And it just says, tell us, is there a job that's not listed here that you'd be good at, that you think we could benefit from? And I said, what the heck? I'll take a chance. And I submitted it and gave them this cover letter and everything. And they happened to have had a discussion. I learned this later from Brandon Turner, the host of the BiggerPockets podcast. He had said the day before I submitted that thing to Mindy Jensen, another BiggerPockets kind of legend, we're kind of struggling with scaling this whole podcast thing. We need someone from like an NPR to just like show up. And Mindy said to him, they would never want to work here. And sure enough, I had sent in that cold pitch.
Dang.
And that one thing led to another. I kind of had to present my case to them and show them, here's the plan that I would put in place. There was a lot that I didn't know back then, but I knew just enough to kind of like, gain their trust to get a remote position, and wound up staying there 3 years and launching like 4 different shows and increasing the frequency of the real estate show from once a week to, 3 times a week. So it was a crazy, crazy journey, and learned a ton.
Wow.
I mean, we all love BiggerPockets. I remember when we created Capital Hacking in 2018. The whole idea was a little bit of an ode to our friend Tim Ferriss, who I'm not actually friends with, but life hacking. But we always talked a lot about BiggerPockets back then. And 3 times a week, can you just drill in on that decision? Why did you take their number one show, Real Estate Podcast, and recommend 3 days a week?
It was over time. It was gradual. So we didn't just pull that trigger overnight. We kind of did it and saw how the audience reacted. And I don't think it was so obvious to do. I do think there was something with the scarcity of once a week that is nice if you have a cult following like BiggerPockets did. I think people really do wait for that Thursday episode. But we were making a fair amount of money on the advertisements on that show, and doubling the cadence of the output from once a week to twice a week probably wasn't going to double the downloads of the show, but it was going to do enough to make it worthwhile, where we're already sitting down to record. The thing that is most valuable is probably the host's time. And if they're sitting down to record, we can squeeze in another recording without it totally throwing everything off. And we know we can increase our bottom line with both advertising and then all the other things that BiggerPockets offered, because as we'll talk about, the show is really much more than just monetizing through ads. Like 99% of the audience listening to this now, if they launch a successful podcast, they'll be monetizing some other way. And right. BiggerPockets was doing that too, right? They're driving you to webinars. They're driving you to books that you might buy, to a conference that you might attend. So that was almost like a master class that I got in like, what are all the ways you can use content to monetize, and all the various on-ramps where people can discover you, gain trust over time, and then eventually make a purchase decision. So I think for us, just final thing on the twice a week thing, we had people that were interested in real estate, and it was a lot of tactical stuff. We also had people that were interested in mindset and lifestyle. And so we wanted to work in more of that content. So that's where the second episode a week came in.
And, there was this theory back when we were getting into this is, by the way, since we're digging a deep positive hole here on BiggerPockets, my interpretation of BiggerPockets' success story, first of all, I'm a big fan of Brandon Turner's quality and Josh Dorkin's original ideas. They had built that for like 6 or 7 years before they had a podcast, and they had some tremendous SEO because of the content, right? The content of their website was so good that Josh Dorkin created that they already had large email list, I believe, large audience in that way. So then when they overlaid the podcast, I think they got initially much more exposure than any other normal podcast would get. Not an NPR podcast, but a normal show. And then they did build their quality up in this show. And so became a virtuous circle of they have all the SEO in the world because they did it for real. And is that your interpretation of their success?
It's a great point. And I think a lot of people overlook that. And, these days, if you have a big audience built from whether you're a social media influencer or you just have a big email audience, you're in a much better position to launch a show. It doesn't mean you can't build it up from nothing, but if you are building it up from nothing with no audience, you're going to have to be extra intentional about like niching down and knowing exactly who the show's for, hustling a little bit to get the word out. But for them, I think they had all those things working in their favor. They had an interest in real estate on the upswing, right? Because you look at the, real estate market during those years, those heady early years of BiggerPockets podcast, it was just crushing. And then finally, I think they had something that a lot of people overlook, which is they really had a vision for a brighter future for the listener. It wasn't just, here's everything you need to know about rental properties. We're going to give you a bunch of information. It was like, we're going here. Are you coming with us? Or are you going to this other place, right? Yeah. Do you believe that you need to pay $25,000 for a boot camp to get started buying your first rental property? Then you're not for us. Like they would explicitly
that was their
say
first,
that.
Yep, they would.
And Josh, to his credit, really like carved out this kind of, here's who we are, here's what we believe in. And, we're going to be kind of one step ahead of you on that journey. We want you to come with us. And we're anti this. We're anti life lived in a cubicle. We're anti taking advantage of newbies by charging them too much. And that I think was really, really powerful to just get people's buy-in. And I think if you're a podcaster or you're thinking about it right now, that's what you need to think about is what is your vision for the brighter future and who are your enemies, whether they're, people, organizations, or just like waste could be an enemy. Wasting your time could be an enemy. Whatever it is, like you need to figure out like what you're for and what you're against.
It's as you're talking, it just makes me think. BiggerPockets, and I've listened to them for years as well. They created a movement. I mean that's ultimately what they did. They created a movement, an amazing community. I want to dive into some of the things that we've touched on because I think it's so interesting for other listeners that are thinking about maybe starting a podcast or just starting out in podcasts. You had touched on some different verticals that it can go on, whether it be ads, whether it be conferences or books. What are so here's two questions. What are some of the other verticals that come along with podcasting? And then as far as you went to 3 shows with BiggerPockets when they just, I think, had one on a Thursday. So you talked about content, mindset. What was the topic of that third show?
Oh, it was probably a Q&A style, which is a great format for people to look at if they have an audience that typically the same questions come up over and over again. So I think David Green started doing a Q&A solo episode that still to this day is super popular. So that was probably the one. And then, since I've left, they've probably even ramped it up even more. So, yeah. But then, talking about kind of other verticals or other ways to monetize, I guess, is that kind of what you were getting at? Yeah. So, advertisements, really your show, you might be able to cover some production costs with ads on your show. If you have, let's say thousands of downloads or even low tens of thousands of downloads, but you're not going to be making like a lot of money that way. And it's gotten even harder in recent years as that advertising market's kind of softened and the economy's gotten a little, choppier. So I think what you really want to think about is what is my offer, and is it coaching? Is it a book? Is it, a webinar that I then make sales on? It's got to be some platform that's outside of the podcast listening experience. Because we all know like the advantages of the podcast listening experience for the content creator are you have that person's pretty much undivided attention. They might be doing something like walking the dog or doing the dishes, but they're not like multitasking and on a call or,
that's a good point.
They're not scrolling their feed typically either when they're listening to shows versus like, if you're trying to grab someone's attention on social media, you're competing against like, who knows what is next in their feed, probably something pretty engaging. So from that aspect, it's great. from the aspect of like, are they in a position to buy at that exact moment? It's not so great. Like, so it's harder to attribute sales to podcast listening. Over time, you can get a feel though, if you're really doing the right thing and driving people to a specific, way that they can opt in to your system. You're kind of trying to drive like email signups or drive them to a low ticket sale or drive them to some kind of way to engage more deeply, like a Facebook group. When we launched the Real Estate Rookie podcast on BiggerPockets, that was great because it appealed to a specific type of person that maybe is a little intimidated by guys doing big syndication deals on the main show. And they wanted to just hear from people that had like 5 to 10 deals under their belt. And that was great as a show. But for BiggerPockets, it's kind of like, okay, great. We have this show. How do we get these people like off of that? Like I've heard people say rented land onto like owned land, and getting them from a place where you have no idea who your podcast listeners are. You just see like 10,000 people downloaded the show. But if they're in a Facebook group, you know more about who they are, and you have the opportunity to kind of like sell in a context on that Facebook group where people are more likely to actually take action, right? Very few people are pausing their podcast and going and buying your coaching program, but people will do that from a Facebook group. So I think it's just like really understanding, and that's kind of what we do with people when they're launching new shows, is where does the podcast fit in to your overall funnel? Is it really how people are discovering you? Are they really discovering you like on your website or through Facebook ads? And the podcast is more like to nurture them through the funnel until a point where they're more ready to buy. And I can think of countless examples where I myself as the consumer have been like, is this person legit? Let me listen to more of their content on their podcast. Right. And then I buy from them.
Got it.
Yep. And that's actually, was our first thought when we built out Capital Hacking was it's not a direct, connection that leads right to a sale, but it's a nurturing and a relationship building. One basic thing from us was a lot of philosophy around farming and relationships take time, but now I want to go back to I want to give BiggerPockets another major plug. And what we witnessed from looking at it in 2018, when I was trying to study the model a little bit and realizing we were beginning our syndication company, we were beginning our platform about helping people realize their own personal value and the combination with capital, financial. And I remember thinking that BiggerPockets is the best at that time at human syndication, right? Human capital syndication. What they were doing at that time was, if Kevin was getting a lot of comments on their community and writing great answers, Kevin was offered a chance to write a blog. If Kevin was writing a good blog and it was getting good traction, Kevin was invited on the show and or XYZ. And so Kevin was doing all that by putting his human capital in. And they were just syndicating that together to create a machine, a good content machine. Now, from the outsider's point of view, that's how it looked. It was probably much more choppy on the inside, but that's where we get Jay Scott. I had this story with Jay Scott, and he was telling me that he and Josh Dorkin were talking about publishing, and it was really just a brainstorm of the two of them. And it seems like they've done great with publishing now. Who would have thought,
Yeah,
so
they
just syndicated great ideas.
Started out that way, where Matt and his wife were writing, I think, blogs, and then he wrote the book on raising private capital for BiggerPockets. So yeah, it's a great point.
It's like they syndicated the talents, right?
Yeah, so true.
And you and I are over here syndicating financial capital for big deals. And honestly, this is where accountable equity came from, John, right? Because accountable equity, we're saying, well, what if the community itself of putting money into deals became human syndication, talent syndication, personal value creation. So anyway, lots there. And so, Kevin, we've been brainstorming this stuff for years, and we appreciate you being on the show because it sounds like you've been a thoughtful soul yourself. And let me ask you a question then.
Hi, this is Melanie McCallan. Josh and I are just so grateful for the many investors who have already joined us at Accountable Equity. Accountable Equity is so much more than a capital group. It's really a community of accredited investors that want to learn and grow together. I just want to personally invite you, if you want to find out more about this type of investment and see if it's right for you and your family, please visit us at accountableequity.com.
At first, when you started telling your backstory, it was a lot about radio, audio editing, NPR probably being the best at that audio experience. You got that job. Sounds super technical, like you actually were skilled at that functional level. So what would you say helped you realize how to, what would you say from that? If you were talking to Kevin back then and Kevin's like really, really serious about the way to do an edit.
I lost you there, Josh.
Oh, did you? How about now? Am I back?
Okay. Yeah, I'm back now. Sorry.
Kev, here's the question. Take me from the time when Kevin was a great editor for NPR and the way you looked at podcasts then to the way you look at these vertical revenue streams and all these new revenue streams. And what has changed with your editing? What has changed with the actual delivery of content in your mind and your talents?
Yeah. Two main things. The biggest one is video, taking a much bigger emphasis in everything that I do. So now when someone says I have a podcast, I almost assume that it's on YouTube and pretty well optimized for YouTube platform versus the other, being put to both places. But I think, what we've seen is like humans are visual creatures and we like to see each other. And although audio has its place and has its place as far as, you're doing other things and you can only listen, ultimately there is a huge market out there and an international market too, that is driven by YouTube, one of the most sophisticated platforms as far as getting the right content in front of the right person that's going to be interested in that thing. And so it's like the beauty of podcasting is it's mostly driven by word of mouth. Like I would probably hear about you guys from Alex Felice, my buddy, who says, "Hey, these guys are great." And that's probably how I originally met you, and it's hard, that's an amazing thing for content creators to really like build their tribe. It's also really slow and difficult to manipulate as the content creator. You're nodding your head.
Oh,
you're
yeah.
like,
It's a patient
this
game.
is a slow burn, right? Like no matter how good of a show I'm creating, and YouTube, BiggerPockets was really smart to put their shows on YouTube. That was way ahead of their time. In 2012 and 13, they were putting full episodes up on YouTube. Some of those have hundreds of thousands or millions of views now, and people are still running across them like 10 years later. So the power of, video and evergreen content and, search, right? Second most powerful search engine on earth, YouTube, owned by Google. And so now whenever I look at an overall strategy, I'm going to say, how does YouTube fit in? What can we do as far as short or medium form videos? And some of the, people we work with now, short form is a big part of what we do. And we might test things on TikTok to see what's resonating and double down on those and then put them on Instagram. There's a lot that you can do, and titles and thumbnails become very important because you just have to compete with everything else that's out there. But the real algorithmic power of YouTube to serve up related content to you is a super, super game changer. And then the other quick thing that's changed is I think people typically will have less patience for long, drawn out introductions, a pre-recorded thing that's like a minute long, that you hear every single episode. I think you have to be more attuned to people's shorter attention spans these days. And that doesn't mean like you can't still produce long content. It just has to be really thoughtfully done where you're front loading it with value, and I've seen a lot of cool things online where you can where YouTubers will record a conversation like this and they'll take like the best Q&A and they'll put it like first, right? They'll be like, Kevin crushed it on that one. Let's like just put that first, then let's get into his backstory. And you can see, how much people hang in there with the content on a retention curve. You can see how many people are dropping off. So that's the main change.
Well said. I mean, that's exactly what I've witnessed from like even your journey when following BiggerPockets for all those years. I imagine that got incorporated in real time each year.
Isn't it wild?
Absolutely. Yeah. They've got multiple.
Isn't it wild to think that these what was that iPods? The iPods
Yeah.
was created for podcasts, and now we're talking about how it's all changed from just audio now to video. Where back in the day they had no idea what they were touching. They were scratching the surface of.
Yeah, yeah, seriously. It reminds me of like someone saying that, we have language and then we started using emojis and like we're almost going back to like hieroglyphics. I feel like everything's kind of like this circular thing where like audio will probably have another moment in the future, but I think as a creator you just have to be in both places and looking at them almost as different audiences. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer when people are like, well, we just have to ramp up our YouTube and that will grow our podcast numbers. And it's like, I think they're actually kind of different audiences. Like the podcast listeners on audio are typically, okay, I've got my thing. I listen here. I'm not letting the algorithm serve it up to me. I'm getting it through my friends or people I already know, like, and trust. And YouTube's more like, okay, you have the ability to get in front of people that have never heard you before, and you better have really good content to make them stick.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. You just slipped into a really interesting technical thing. Should the show on YouTube be the highlight reel of the audio show?
It's a good question. I mean, I think you have more latitude to make it, I think in audio, and this is just a little bit my intuition, but I think in audio, you want to be more, tell the whole story a little more chronologically. Versus when you have visual cues, you're able to skip around a little bit more, and you can even do like cool things. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that sports talk show, Pardon the Interruption, PTI, where they put the rundown of the show on the screen on the side, and it's kind of like a little open loop in your head where you're like, I want to get to what they say about Ohtani's gambling scandal at the bottom. So let me just like wait till after this break. So YouTube allows you to do things like that, like orient the viewer and show them like, where are we in the show, or here's what we've got coming up next. And there's just other things to distract them. Versus audio, it's linear, right? Like they would always say in radio, you only have one chance to tell someone something. So you better be really clear about how you do it, because they're gone. They can't rewind it, on podcasts they can, but people typically don't want to do that. So on YouTube, I think it's really smart to experiment with that of like, let's move things around chronologically. And, all this kind of takes some time and resources, but let's experiment with, putting this part of the show first and see if, like I said, the data on YouTube will show you how many people were listening at the 30-second mark of this interview.
And then that brings me to the last thing about podcast growth through the platform, like in iTunes, which back in the day was the only way to do it. Now I think it's called podcasts. But I remember in 2018, maybe it's a urban legend, that frequency and consistency made Apple show you more often in certain, almost like in a search, not in a search, but in a lookalike audience. Was that true? And is it true today? Is there a way to follow the algorithms of Apple, just like you're saying you can follow the algorithms, or you can be searchable in YouTube?
I think, no, I don't really think so. It's not really that kind of platform that surfaces things algorithmically. There's a chart, and that chart, I know very few podcast listeners that even consult that chart. Maybe when they first open their app, they look at it, but typically those are going to be huge shows. They're going to be the newer shows. It prioritizes like newer shows because people who have subscribed in the last 24 hours is one of the bigger data points that they use to get people up on the charts. So it's really not, it's just a fool's errand to try to like do any gaming of the system. And I think this is true with most technology, is like, at first, when it comes out, you can kind of game the system. You can like stuff a bunch of keywords into your title, and you're like, great, like let's put Dave Ramsey's name in our podcast title, and people will kind of find us that way. And then over time, the platform gets smarter and realizes like, okay, we're going to stop allowing them to do that. Only the best stuff is going to rise to the top. So on Apple, there's not much you can do. You can submit your show to them for their consideration, and then an editorial team there will decide whether it should be featured, as part of some seasonal promotion. So if you had some veterans, if you're a veterans podcast, I worked with a guy who has a podcast about financial freedom for veterans. And I said, why don't you submit to Apple for ahead of Veterans Day? And, you're crossing your fingers when you do that, and you have thousands of other people doing it. So you're kind of just hoping that they do and give you that bump. So I would focus much more on things that are inside your own control, which is like creating really engaging for short form content that might do really well on Instagram or YouTube. And then doing some things like appearing on like-minded podcasts as a guest, for example, can be a really powerful way to grow your own brand and your show, because you're reaching people that are already podcast listeners and they're already kind of bought into that host. And if that host is having you, it's an implicit endorsement of you in a way. So those are a couple of things on the growth. And then there's some other things we could get into.
Well, I think you've done more than I ever could have hoped for in this show, right, John?
Yeah, that was amazing. Kevin, where can our listeners follow up and find you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So my business is called Podcast Pointman, and we are a full service podcast agency. And I should say that includes video. So our team does video editing, audio editing. And I think probably the thing that sets us apart is when we first start working with someone, we do a full consultation looking at their whole business and where does the podcast fit in vis-a-vis like where they actually make money. So how can we actually turn this channel, we're going to do everything we can to make the numbers grow, but that doesn't really matter if it doesn't turn into some kind of sales that can more than pay for itself down the road. So we try to really like consult on the strategy of where it all fits in, how you make those calls to action, how you structure your show. And then we do ongoing production on a monthly basis.
Man, fantastic. Great job articulating.
So podcastpointman.com is the best place to find me.
Thank you, buddy. I look forward to the next great conversation. Kevin, you've been awesome.
Appreciate you gues. Thanks very much.
Thanks, brother.
Damn straight. We just got buddy. We got to the end of another great show. And everyone listening right now, you're the family and friends. Thanks for staying till the end.
That was so fun. And hey, hit the like, hit subscribe. We're here to serve you guys. That's why we're doing this show. Josh is not paying me. I'm doing this off of my quote unquote sweat equity because we want to make a difference in your life. And then that ripple effect will continue to touch the world.
Hey, amen, brother. Please check us out on capitalhacking.com, all the social media threads. And yes, I know you've probably already sent this episode to one of your best friends. Thank you. We love you. Just go right into your iPhone, hit the plus symbol. We'll talk to you later. See you next week.
Share.